Dien Bien Phu ended in May 1954 with the collapse of a French fortress that was never supposed to fall. France had air superiority, modern artillery, a fortified valley designed to trap its enemy. And yet, the Viet Minh did not just win. They dismantled the logic behind the fortress itself. How does a force without trucks, without paved roads, without industrial logistics, move heavy artillery into mountains that European officers openly described as impassable? Why did French command remain confident even as their airstrips were slowly erased from the map? And why did a strategy that should have collapsed under its own weight instead tighten, day by day, until the outcome became irreversible? Because Dien Bien Phu was not decided by tactics. It was decided by a gamble on something military doctrine rarely treats as decisive power. In the next sections, we will dissect how that gamble worked, why it nearly failed, and what it cost. This episode is not about who fired first, or which hill fell on which day. It is about a strategic paradox. The French designed Dien Bien Phu as a rational solution to an asymmetric war. They believed that by anchoring a strong, well-supplied fortress deep inland, they could force the Viet Minh into a conventional battle, one where French artillery, air power, and logistics would finally matter. From the French perspective, the logic was clean. The valley was remote. The surrounding terrain was hostile. Any attempt to move heavy weapons through that environment should have been slow, visible, and vulnerable. Air supply would compensate for distance. Firepower would compensate for numbers. From a doctrinal standpoint, this was sound. From a systems standpoint, it was catastrophic. The Viet Minh did not attempt to beat French firepower head-on. They did not rush the fortress. They did not seek a quick, decisive engagement. Instead, they chose a strategy that most professional militaries would have rejected outright. They built an entire campaign around the assumption that human endurance, organized, disciplined, and pushed to its limit, could substitute for industrial logistics. They treated society itself as a supply network. They accepted levels of exhaustion, loss, and delay that no conventional army would willingly plan for. This is what makes Dien Bien Phu strategically abnormal. Not the bravery. Not the outcome. But the decision to construct a war plan whose weakest point was not firepower, or maneuver, or intelligence, but collapse from within. If this system failed, it would fail silently. Not in one dramatic defeat, but through starvation, breakdown, disease, and desertion. There would be no fallback position. No rapid extraction. No way to adjust the plan. This was not a clever trick. It was an all-or-nothing bet on whether an entire organization, and the society feeding it, could endure longer than the enemy believed possible. And the deeper problem is this. French command never seriously considered that such a strategy could exist. That blind spot, more than any shell or trench, defined the battle that followed. Because once both sides committed to incompatible assumptions about what was possible, the outcome stopped being about strength, and became about who misunderstood reality first. At Dien Bien Phu, the opposing sides were not just fighting each other. They were fighting incompatible models of war. France entered the valley with a clear objective: force the Viet Minh into a conventional confrontation under conditions that neutralized guerrilla advantages. The fortress was meant to function as both bait and barrier. Bait, because its presence deep inland would compel engagement. Barrier, because its firepower and air supply would make sustained assault irrational. This was not a defensive reflex. It was an attempt to impose a decision on the war. French command believed they were solving several problems at once. By choosing the valley, they shortened their own supply lines through airlift while extending the Viet Minh's overland routes to an extreme. By fortifying fixed positions, they converted a fluid insurgency into a targetable force. By concentrating elite units, artillery, and air support, they expected to demonstrate that the balance of power was still fundamentally asymmetric. In their model, Dien Bien Phu was not a risk. It was a correction. But every strategic design rests on constraints, and those constraints quietly define what is possible. The valley was remote. The surrounding hills were steep, forested, and roadless. The climate punished prolonged exposure. For France, these were acceptable trade-offs because air power supposedly erased geography. Aircraft would deliver ammunition, food, reinforcements, and evacuate the wounded. As long as the airstrip functioned, the fortress lived. As long as the fortress lived, the Viet Minh would bleed. For the Viet Minh, the constraints were different and far harsher. They faced an opponent with superior technology, firepower, and logistics on paper. They lacked vehicles, fuel, paved roads, and secure depots. Their troops were operating at the end of long, fragile supply chains. Politically, they could not afford a visible failure. Militarily, they could not afford a rapid, frontal defeat. Time worked against them only if they allowed it to. The critical asymmetry lay not in weapons, but in assumptions. French planners assumed that terrain functioned as an obstacle to the attacker. They assumed that heavy artillery required industrial logistics. They assumed that air supply, though risky, was ultimately reliable. They assumed that the Viet Minh would seek a decisive battle or withdraw. The Viet Minh leadership assessed the same environment and reached a different conclusion. They treated terrain not as a barrier, but as cover. They treated time not as a liability, but as leverage. They treated suffering not as a breakdown point, but as a resource to be managed. Most importantly, they recognized that French dependence on air supply was not a strength but a single point of failure. This is where the strategic map begins to distort. On French charts, Dien Bien Phu was a node of control. On the Viet Minh's mental map, it was an isolated organism sustained by a narrow lifeline. Every shell fired at the runway, every hill fortified around the valley, was not just tactical pressure. It was an attack on the French theory of survival. Neither side misunderstood the stakes. But only one side understood the nature of the game being played. France believed the battle would be decided by firepower and maneuver inside the valley. The Viet Minh believed it would be decided by whether the valley could be kept alive at all. And inside those opposing beliefs, something unusual was taking shape. A strategy that did not aim to defeat the enemy's army directly, but to suffocate the system that made that army possible. And it was precisely within these constraints, terrain, logistics, time, and belief, that a move most officers would never authorize began to make sense. Military doctrine exists to reduce uncertainty. It offers patterns that have worked before, principles that promise control. At Dien Bien Phu, doctrine spoke clearly and confidently. A fortified position, supplied by air, defended by superior firepower, should not be vulnerable to a force lacking mechanized logistics. An attacker without roads should not be able to sustain artillery. An insurgent army should not willingly accept a prolonged, static engagement against a modern opponent. According to the rulebook, the French plan was not reckless. It was textbook. Under conventional logic, the Viet Minh had two viable options. The first was avoidance, bypass the fortress, preserve forces, continue a protracted war elsewhere. The second was a rapid, high-risk assault, overwhelm the position before French firepower could fully engage. Both options aligned with established thinking. Both options were studied. Both were rejected. Why? Because either choice would have led to strategic dead ends. Avoidance would concede political momentum and validate the French claim that fixed positions could dominate territory. A rapid assault would expose the Viet Minh to concentrated artillery and airstrikes, producing losses they could not replace. The doctrine-sanctioned paths all led to failure, just different kinds. This is the point where normal strategy stopped being useful. French doctrine assumed that air supply neutralized distance. It assumed that artillery superiority imposed psychological and material dominance. It assumed that time favored the defender with better logistics. None of these assumptions were irrational in isolation. But together, they formed a closed system, one that only worked if the enemy accepted its premises. The Viet Minh did not. Instead of treating French strengths as fixed realities, they treated them as conditional. Air supply only worked if runways survived. Artillery dominance only mattered if it could see and reach its targets. Defensive fortifications only held if the surrounding terrain remained neutral. Doctrine failed not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. It did not account for an enemy willing to reorganize society to change the terms of engagement. From a doctrinal standpoint, dragging heavy artillery through jungle-covered mountains without roads was irrational. The effort required would be enormous. The exposure risk was high. The logistical tail would be fragile. And once deployed, those guns would be difficult to reposition or protect. Any professional officer trained in conventional warfare would identify this as an unacceptable concentration of risk. That is precisely why it worked. The French evaluated Viet Minh capabilities through the lens of their own organizational limits. They assumed the enemy would break under the strain long before the plan matured. They assumed that suffering would impose a natural ceiling on operational ambition. What doctrine did not teach them was how an opponent might deliberately build a strategy around enduring what doctrine considers intolerable. This is the core contradiction. If the Viet Minh fought correctly, they would lose. To have a chance at victory, they had to fight incorrectly, by every standard their opponent trusted. They had to accept a strategy that offered no rapid success, no clean exit, and no guarantee of survival if anything went wrong. Doctrine could not adapt to that kind of thinking. It had no vocabulary for a war plan whose decisive factor was not combat efficiency, but organizational endurance under extreme stress. And once that realization took hold, the question was no longer whether the Viet Minh would follow the rules. It was whether they could survive breaking them. Because abandoning doctrine does not produce a solution, it produces a gamble. And the next question is how that gamble was even authorized. The decision that defined Dien Bien Phu did not emerge as a stroke of certainty. It emerged as an argument. Inside Viet Minh Command, the idea of committing to a prolonged siege backed by manually transported heavy artillery was not universally accepted. It challenged intuition, experience, and political caution at the same time. This was not a plan that promised elegance. It promised strain. At the center of the debate was a single, dangerous question: should the campaign aim for speed, or for inevitability? A rapid assault offered clarity. It matched revolutionary instincts. It reduced exposure to air power. But it also risked annihilation if French defenses held. A slower approach inverted the risk. It multiplied logistical burdens, delayed results, and tested morale. But if it worked, it would change the structure of the battle itself. What made the slow option controversial was not only its difficulty, but its assumptions. The strategy depended on three fragile premises. First, that artillery could be moved, concealed, and supplied without collapsing the support network behind it. Second, that troops and civilian labor could sustain extreme workloads for months without systemic failure. Third, that French command would remain committed to the fortress long enough for pressure to accumulate. None of these premises were guaranteed. Each could fail independently. And failure in one would cascade into the others. Opposition within the command focused on precisely this compounding risk. A failed assault would cost lives. A failed logistics strategy could cost the war's credibility. If the guns could not be positioned effectively, the entire operation would devolve into a static stalemate under air attack. There would be no partial success to salvage. This was not a flexible plan. It was brittle by design. Yet the plan also offered something no alternative could. It attacked the French system, not their formations. Instead of confronting firepower, it aimed to neutralize the conditions that made firepower decisive. Instead of defeating units, it targeted sustainment. The fortress would not be stormed. It would be isolated, compressed, and slowly stripped of its assumptions. The decision-makers understood the psychological dimension as well. French confidence rested on the belief that the Viet Minh could not endure prolonged exposure to modern warfare. Proving that belief wrong would have effects beyond the valley. It would reshape how future operations were conceived. That strategic signaling mattered as much as the immediate outcome. Authorizing the plan meant accepting responsibility for controlled exhaustion. It meant managing dissent, fear, and doubt within one's own ranks. It meant committing to a course where the margin between success and collapse was measured not in days, but in human limits. This was not a choice between aggression and caution. It was a choice between visible risk and invisible risk. Between a fast failure everyone could understand, and a slow gamble few could fully grasp until it was too late to reverse. Once that choice was made, the strategy stopped being theoretical. It had to be built, carried, fed, and protected, step by step, under constant pressure. And that is where a strategy that looked daring on paper began to reveal how easily it could break in the real world. Once the decision was locked in, the strategy entered its most dangerous phase. Not contact with the enemy, but translation into reality. This was the moment where ideas stopped being persuasive and started being tested by gravity, weather, fatigue, and fear. The Viet Minh were no longer debating doctrine. They were attempting to turn an abstract gamble into a functioning system under constant threat. The first problem was mechanical. Artillery pieces designed for roads had to move across terrain that offered none. Guns were disassembled, dragged, lifted, lowered, and reassembled in sections. Slopes were carved by hand. Paths were widened just enough to pass, then concealed again. Nothing about this process was efficient. It consumed time at a rate no modern logistics planner would tolerate. And yet efficiency was not the metric that mattered. Continuity was. Every movement required coordination between combat units, engineering teams, and civilian labor. Food, ammunition, medical support, and replacements all moved along the same fragile arteries. These were not supply lines in the conventional sense. They were supply pulses, rhythms that had to be maintained or the entire system would seize. A missed delivery did not delay an operation. It endangered lives already committed to immobile positions. Concealment was the second challenge. Artillery only mattered if it survived long enough to fire repeatedly. French air power could devastate exposed positions, so the guns had to disappear into terrain. Emplacements were dug into hillsides. Firing positions were camouflaged. After each engagement, pieces were relocated or masked. This required discipline bordering on obsession. One lapse, one pattern detected, and the illusion of invisibility would collapse. But the most precarious element was not technical. It was human endurance. The strategy assumed that exhaustion could be managed rather than avoided. Labor units worked under conditions that blurred the line between military operation and physical attrition. Rest cycles were shortened. Injuries accumulated. Morale fluctuated. This was not incidental. It was intrinsic to the plan. The system functioned by continuously drawing from a reserve of resilience that could not be measured or replenished easily. There were moments when the plan nearly unraveled. Weather disrupted movement. Casualties mounted faster than anticipated. Ammunition expenditure threatened to outpace delivery. Each of these pressures forced adjustments at the margin. Routes were shifted. Timelines stretched. Priorities were reordered. What mattered was not preventing crisis, but absorbing it without collapse. Meanwhile, the French fortress still stood. From the valley, the enemy appeared to be suffering delays rather than advancing toward decision. This misperception was critical. It bought time. It reinforced French confidence that the attacker was overreaching. In reality, every delay was being converted into positional advantage. Every day without decisive engagement tightened the operational vice. Execution transformed the strategy from an improbable idea into an irreversible process. The deeper the Viet Minh committed, the less freedom they had to disengage. This was the hidden risk of the plan. Success required momentum, but momentum increased vulnerability. If the French had identified the system's pressure points early enough, if they had broken the supply rhythm rather than contesting firepower, the outcome could have shifted dramatically. By the time that possibility became visible, it was already constrained by the same assumptions that shaped the original French plan. The fortress could not move. The air supply could not adapt fast enough. And the battle had quietly shifted from combat to endurance. Because at this stage, the question was no longer whether the Viet Minh could keep fighting, but whether the French could recognize what kind of fight they were actually in. French command did not ignore what was happening around Dien Bien Phu. They observed movement. They registered losses. They understood that the situation was deteriorating. But they interpreted every signal through a framework that made the wrong conclusions feel reasonable. From the French perspective, the early phase of the siege confirmed expectations. Viet Minh activity appeared slow, costly, and disorganized. Artillery fire was intermittent. Assaults were cautious. Air supply continued, even under increasing pressure. None of this looked like the prelude to systemic collapse. It looked like an attacker exhausting itself against a fortified position. This interpretation mattered more than any single tactical error. French command believed they were winning the long game simply by holding. Every day the fortress survived reinforced the belief that the Viet Minh would eventually reach a breaking point. Attrition, they assumed, favored the side with industrial backing and external support. Time, in their model, was an ally. What they failed to see was that time was being weaponized against them. The French response focused on preserving the fortress rather than rethinking its role. Reinforcements were flown in. Defensive positions were strengthened. Counter-battery fire attempted to suppress enemy guns. These actions were rational within their doctrinal logic. They addressed visible threats. They did not address the system creating those threats. The critical error was misidentifying the center of gravity. French command treated Viet Minh artillery as the problem. In reality, artillery was only the symptom. The underlying issue was the logistics system that allowed those guns to appear, disappear, and persist. Suppressing individual positions did nothing to disrupt the flow of ammunition, labor, and replacements feeding the siege. Air power, the cornerstone of French confidence, became both indispensable and deceptive. As the runway came under sustained fire, supply drops replaced landings. This adaptation preserved the fortress temporarily, but at a cost. Airdrops were less precise. Losses increased. Every sortie became a gamble. Instead of restoring control, air supply narrowed the margin for error. Psychologically, the situation degraded in parallel. Defenders experienced a growing sense of enclosure. Positions that were once dominant became targets. The hills, initially dismissed as irrelevant, turned into platforms of pressure. Morale eroded not because of a single defeat, but because the logic of survival no longer felt stable. Command structure compounded the problem. Decision-making remained centralized and reactive. Adjustments were incremental. There was no decisive break from the original concept of operations. The fortress had been designed as an anchor. Admitting that it had become a liability would require a level of strategic reversal that institutions resist under pressure. By the time French leadership began to grasp that they were not facing a conventional siege, their options were structurally limited. Withdrawal was politically fraught and operationally complex. Escalation through firepower risked accelerating ammunition depletion. Negotiation was not yet viable. The system they relied on had no clean exit. The Viet Minh did not outmaneuver the French tactically. They outlasted their interpretive framework. Every French reaction reinforced the assumptions that kept them trapped. Every attempt to restore control deepened dependence on a system that was failing. This is where the battle crossed its point of no return. Not when a position fell, but when the French understanding of the conflict could no longer produce effective choices. And once that threshold was crossed, the final outcome became less a matter of combat, and more a matter of cost. By the time Dien Bien Phu collapsed, the result no longer felt sudden. It felt exhausted. The French positions did not fall because of a single breakthrough or a dramatic operational stroke. They failed because the system sustaining them could no longer absorb pressure. Air supply degraded beyond reliability. Defensive positions became isolated pockets rather than a coherent network. Firepower still existed, but it no longer translated into control. From the outside, the ending appeared inevitable. From the inside, it felt suffocating. The immediate outcome was clear. The fortress ceased to function as a military instrument. Units surrendered. Command authority dissolved into localized survival decisions. What had been designed as a symbol of dominance became a demonstration of vulnerability. The strategic wager France had placed on fixed power projection collapsed under conditions it could neither reverse nor escape. But focusing only on the French defeat misses the deeper cost of the strategy that defeated them. For the Viet Minh, victory did not come cheaply. The logistics system that enabled success extracted an immense human toll. Thousands of laborers operated at the edge of physical endurance. Casualties occurred far from the front lines, through disease, exhaustion, accidents, and exposure. The distinction between combatant and support blurred into irrelevance. The campaign consumed not only material resources, but the resilience of the society sustaining it. This was not collateral damage. It was structural. The strategy required accepting losses that would be unacceptable under most conventional military planning frameworks. Success depended on pushing people beyond sustainable limits, trusting that organizational discipline and political commitment would hold longer than physical collapse. There was also a psychological cost borne by leadership. Authorizing this strategy meant carrying responsibility for suffering that could not be localized or hidden. Every delay increased strain. Every adjustment deepened commitment. There was no moment where the cost peaked and receded. It accumulated until the end. Politically, the victory reshaped perceptions. It demonstrated that a non-industrial force could defeat a modern army by redefining what counted as military power. But it also created expectations, internally and externally, that such endurance could be replicated indefinitely. That assumption would prove dangerous in other contexts. And the strategy was not immune to failure. Had French countermeasures disrupted supply rhythms more effectively, had weather imposed harsher constraints, had morale fractured earlier, the entire campaign could have collapsed without a decisive battle. In that scenario, the losses incurred would have lacked even the justification of success. Dien Bien Phu was not a clean triumph of ingenuity over strength. It was a calculated trade, extreme organizational strain exchanged for strategic collapse on the other side. The outcome validated the gamble, but it did not erase its brutality. Understanding that cost matters, because without it, the strategy becomes myth. And myths obscure the real lesson. Because if this victory was not about heroism or inevitability, then the final question is what it actually teaches about how wars are decided. Dien Bien Phu is often remembered as a battle where the weaker side overcame superior technology. That framing is comforting. It suggests a moral symmetry. It implies inevitability. But it misses the strategic core. This was not a victory of improvisation over professionalism. It was a victory of one system of war over another, because the second system never realized it was being challenged. At its deepest level, the strategy at Dien Bien Phu was not about artillery, terrain, or siege tactics. It was about redefining what constituted usable power. French command measured power in aircraft, guns, and fortified positions. The Viet Minh measured power in organizational endurance, social mobilization, and the ability to convert time into pressure. These metrics did not compete directly. They bypassed each other. This is why the strategy appeared irrational from the outside. It violated the rule that logistics must be protected by efficiency. It violated the assumption that human limits impose a ceiling on operational ambition. It violated the idea that decisive battles are defined by moments of contact. Instead, it treated exhaustion as a controllable variable and delay as an asset. The first principle revealed here is uncomfortable. War is not decided by who suffers less, but by who can make suffering functional for longer. The Viet Minh did not eliminate hardship. They organized it. They structured it. They absorbed it into planning assumptions rather than treating it as failure. This does not make the strategy virtuous. It makes it effective under specific conditions. The second principle is about fragility. The French fortress was powerful but brittle. It depended on uninterrupted systems, air supply, centralized command, predictable terrain dominance. Once those systems were stressed simultaneously, the fortress could not adapt. Strength became rigidity. Control became dependence. What looked resilient on paper lacked elasticity in reality. The third principle concerns misrecognition. French command never fully accepted that they were fighting a different type of war inside the same battle. They reacted correctly to the wrong problem. They suppressed fire without dismantling logistics. They reinforced positions without restoring strategic freedom. They treated the symptoms of pressure while ignoring its source. This is why the lesson of Dien Bien Phu cannot be reduced to never build fortresses or never underestimate an opponent. Those are shallow conclusions. The real lesson is narrower and sharper. A strategy becomes dangerous when it assumes the enemy shares its definition of what is possible. Can this strategy be replicated? Rarely. It requires conditions that are hard to reproduce: political cohesion, societal mobilization, tolerance for extreme loss, and an opponent whose doctrine creates exploitable blind spots. Outside that alignment, the same approach would likely collapse under its own weight. That is what makes Dien Bien Phu genuinely unorthodox. It was not a universal solution. It was a precise answer to a specific strategic environment, and it worked because it targeted assumptions rather than forces. The battle did not prove that endurance always defeats technology. It proved that technology, when insulated by doctrine, can be strategically outmaneuvered by a system willing to redefine the cost of war. And that is why Dien Bien Phu remains unsettling, not as a story of victory, but as a reminder that wars are often lost long before anyone realizes they are playing the wrong game. Dien Bien Phu forces an uncomfortable conclusion. The battle was decided not by a single mistake, nor by a single brilliant insight, but by a prolonged mismatch between belief and reality. One side believed war could be contained within controllable variables. The other believed war could be expanded until those variables lost meaning. there is a temptation to turn this outcome into a parable of inevitability. To say that history was always moving in this direction. But nothing about this strategy was safe. Nothing about it was guaranteed. It functioned because the people who designed it were willing to accept consequences that most institutions are structurally built to avoid. That willingness is not inherently admirable. It is dangerous. It can succeed once and fail catastrophically the next time. What matters is understanding it, not celebrating it. Dien Bien Phu shows how a modern military can lose not because it is weak, but because it is certain. Certain about doctrine. Certain about logistics. Certain about what an enemy cannot do. When certainty hardens into structure, it becomes predictable. And predictability is a vulnerability. This is why the battle still matters beyond its time and place. Not because it offers a template, but because it exposes a fault line that exists in every organized system of force. The fault line between efficiency and resilience. Between control and adaptability. Between what is taught and what is endured. In future campaigns, in different wars, under different flags, the same question will return in new forms. Not, who has more power, but, who decides what power means. And when that question is answered incorrectly, the outcome may already be sealed, long before the first position falls. Dien Bien Phu does not end with surrender. It ends with a distortion. After 1954, militaries around the world studied the battle, but many studied the wrong thing. They looked for tactical takeaways. They counted guns. They mapped hills. They debated siege techniques. What they largely avoided was the deeper implication that a war can be decided by a force willing to redesign the boundary between society and combat. This is the danger of misreading unorthodox strategy. When a rare alignment of conditions produces success, observers are tempted to extract a formula. But Dien Bien Phu was not a formula. It was a convergence of political pressure, organizational discipline, doctrinal blindness, and a tolerance for cost that cannot be assumed elsewhere. In later conflicts, actors would try to replicate pieces of this logic. Some would attempt to weaponize endurance. Others would try to stretch logistics beyond their design limits. Many would fail, not because the idea was wrong, but because the conditions were absent. Endurance without cohesion becomes collapse. Mobilization without legitimacy becomes coercion. Suffering without strategic payoff becomes waste. That is the quiet warning embedded in this campaign. Unorthodox strategies are often remembered only when they work. When they fail, they are dismissed as madness. But the line between the two is thinner than history prefers to admit. Dien Bien Phu sits on that line. One misjudgment in weather, morale, or counteraction, and the same strategy would be cited as evidence of reckless overreach. This is why the study of unconventional campaigns cannot stop at outcomes. It must interrogate assumptions. It must examine what leaders believed about human limits, institutional rigidity, and the enemy's imagination. It must ask not only why a strategy succeeded, but why it was allowed to exist in the first place. In the episodes that follow in this series, we will return to that question again and again. Different wars. Different technologies. Different cultures. The same pattern, a decision that should not have worked, confronting an opponent who could not imagine it would. Because history's most unsettling campaigns are not those that broke the rules. They are the ones that revealed the rules were never universal to begin with.